This week I'm stuck at home, but I really want to paint a landscape. I'm getting cabin fever and just going kind of crazy looking at social media. So I've got an easy step-by-step approach to help all of us paint a landscape from the comfort of our home using a photo on our computer. Follow along. Step number 1. Make yourself some tea. So once you have your pot of tea ready, create a nice little station for doing some painting in front of your computer because we are going to be working from a photo. So first of all, get your journal here set up, and I am using a Stillman and Burn Zeta series right now, and that's a little bit heavier of paper. I mean, it's Beta series. It's a little bit heavier of paper than I usually use, so it's actually 270 GSM instead of, I think I usually use 170 or 150, and a little bit better for watercolor, but whatever sketchbook you're using is fine. Get that set up, and I like to use one of these bulldog clips here to keep my page nice and flat. You can use 2 of them if you want, and then get whatever drawing tool you're going to be using. So for this tutorial I recommend using Graphite. I think this is HB, so not too dark, not too soft but not too hard either. And then another option would be a gray pen. So here is the Zebra pen, makes gray ink. I did a review about these recently. And then my favorite is the Pilot, which is double-sided and has gray on one side. And I use this for the underdrawing that we're gonna do in a second. Of course, get your watercolor ready, whatever palette you use. I obviously like the John Muir Laws one that I've been using for about 6 years. This is a new one that he gave me recently because I wore out my last one. So get that all ready to go, and whatever brushes you're gonna be using. So I'm gonna be using the Pentel Aquash, and I use the large, and I've got a couple of those ready. And then also a frame like this. This is something that's going to be even more important for nature journaling in the field, but go ahead and make one of these now if you can. This is Bristol paper, so it's not even that heavy weight, but the best would be to use cardstock or something, and I used an X-Acto knife to cut out the inside and scissors. I didn't even use a ruler. I didn't measure these dimensions. I just sort of eyeballed it. So just make something like this really quick for now, and in the future you can spend more time thinking about this. And then the last but not least would be to have some type of rag ready for cleaning your brush. Lately I've been enjoying using paper towel with a little bit of Scotch tape, and I just tape that onto my desk. It's really convenient. So get all those things set up. Take a moment, if you're going to be following along and doing this with me, take a moment to get all those things set up. Alright, so some of you have probably seen my tutorial about mindset. And you might have seen in other videos I've talked about, once you're in front of the computer, it's really easy to get distracted compared to when you're nature journaling outside. So you have to have a little bit of self-awareness here and be careful that you don't just end up spending forever looking through your Photos apps. So I got my photo app open, and I'm comfortable. I've got my setup, I've got my tea. I'm turning off all notifications, which I usually have off anyways, but if your computer makes any beeping sound or it rings a bell when you get a text from somebody, you got to turn that stuff off while you're doing this, especially during times like this. That is not what you want to be doing. If you know you don't have very much self-discipline around distractions like that, you might even want to turn off your internet temporarily while you're doing this, or you can use, there's certain apps that will shut down Facebook and things like that so you won't get distracted. Now spend a little bit of time looking through your photos and deciding what would be a good landscape to paint. So choosing a good photo is really important, and when I teach landscape painting in the field, I tell people that making a good choice of subject is a really powerful way to have a big impact without necessarily improving your drawing skills. You can make a better drawing or painting just by choosing a better photo. So one thing that I would recommend is don't choose any photos that have the sun in them. So a lot of times people love taking photos of landscapes that are sunsets, you know. So here's a beautiful photo that I took in Tanzania, and I was tempted to make this into my landscape painting, but having a sun in there is going to complicate things. So for right now, just keep it simple. Choose a photo that doesn't have a sun. A couple other things to look for is this does have several elements that we like. So for example, there is this road here, and you can see that this road or this path goes off into the distance. That's a really useful element. So having elements that recede like that, whether they're a creek or a body of water or a fence line even, those really help create a sense of depth. Another couple things here that are useful is you can see that there's several layers of receding background. So we have two different sets of hills in the background that give this sense of depth. And this photo could actually be even better if some of those were closer. Another thing that this photo has that we like for a landscape painting is it has shapes from the foreground that overlap the background. So see how these trees come up and overlap the background? That also creates a sense of depth, just the same way that my hands do if they're in front of each other like that. Going back to the computer, that gives you like 3 levels. So if you can simplify things in your landscape to like 3 levels, that would be great. What else is important? So here's an example of something we probably wouldn't choose. In this photo, you can see that all of these elements kind of blend together, so you don't really see that there is a clear gradation going back into the distance, and there's also this really strong dark shadow in the foreground, which will be kind of confusing in your painting. So just a couple things like that you can make decisions on what you choose for your subject will make it a lot easier to make a good painting. The other thing about this to remember is that if you make a landscape painting and you look at it and it doesn't look quite right, like if you tried from this photo, or if you were in nature and you painted this and you look at it, you might judge yourself and think like, I suck at painting landscapes. But it's actually something about the choice of the subject matter. That subject matter, even for someone who is really good, would be harder to make it look good. And so I also think that it's fun to experiment with cropping. So I'm not going to talk about this too much in this one, but it is fun to experiment with cropping. So this photo automatically looks a lot more dramatic because of the cropping, and this weird sort of long skinny frame makes more drama than if this were just a square. This particular framing is also intentional because this is in the Serengeti, and in the Serengeti there's this like long distance and expanse, so this type of cropping makes more sense for that one. Whereas in this other example, this is a sunset, and in this sunset there's a lot of gradations of color going up and down, so this tall skinny cropping actually looks good. And this could be a fun thing to experiment with in your nature journaling, painting from photos. And you can see in this particular photo there is a very good example of these sort of receding colors going into the distance. Now I did say for today we're not going to do any suns, so don't choose something with the sun in it. So I'm going to go back into my photo app here, and let me see, I think I have one more example. Okay, here's another example of something not to choose. This is the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, and there's this kind of unusual atmospheric effect. So a lot of times when we're taking photos of landscapes, we're attracted to things like this, but you can see there's these sort of sunbeams coming through. Now this is going to be more advanced. So for today, let's skip. If you've chosen a photo like this is going to be very challenging, especially with watercolor. So for today, don't choose a photo like that. Did you notice that there was a line in the foreground, by the way? So I'm going to go back to my photo app here, and I want you to spend a few moments choosing a photo that you want. This is the one that I've chosen for today, and I'm going to edit it actually. But take a moment now and choose a photo you want. Give yourself a limited amount of time. You might even set a timer and choose a photo that you want. Now that you've chosen a photo, go ahead and open up I'm using the photo app on Macintosh, but whatever photo app you have, go ahead and open up your photo to edit it. and then you'll get a bunch of different options for editing. And what I'm gonna do first of all for right now is I'm gonna look at different ways that I could crop this. So this is currently a square, but I'm gonna see if there is something a little bit more dramatic that I can use. And remember, this is a really powerful tool that you get here. So when you go into cropping, you get a grid that shows you your photo broken down into thirds. And so that allows you to use the rule of thirds. So for example, I wouldn't want my primary subject or primary point of interest to be right in the middle. And I also wouldn't want my horizon to be right in the middle. I would want my horizon to be on one of these thirds lines or a little bit offset like that. So what I'll do is I'll play around and go ahead and just play around a little bit looking at what it would look like if you did it different ways. And the good thing about this is on most of these apps, you can always go back, revert it to the original, and save a version. You can save a version of it however you want. So obviously this would be almost all sky. I don't think I want that. I might actually make it so that there's a little bit less sky. And a little bit less of this foreground brush here. But I don't really want to cut that water off. Bring the sky down a little bit more. And so think about what shape you're going to use, and if this shape is close to the shape that you crop your photo to. That way, if you use this shape to trace out your frame on here, you'll be good. So I think I like this. I'm going to give a little bit more on the bottom. This cropping part is really important, and doing this on the computer is way easier, or doing it on your phone is way easier than doing it in the field. And this is one of the main mistakes people make when they're painting landscapes in the field, because we don't see things like this in our vision. We see this huge expanse, and then when we come to our paper, we try to paint that and it doesn't work. So practicing at home, because we're stuck at home because of quarantine or whatever, is actually a useful way to develop this skill. And then when you're in the field, using a tool like this can help, or just practicing in your mind, cropping and framing this thing. So I like the way this looks. So I'm gonna say done for that. And then, the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn this to black and white, okay? So go ahead and crop your photo and then turn it to black and white. And we're gonna use this black and white version to sketch in our landscape and to get the values. And then we're gonna turn it back to color for painting the color. You ready for that? All right, so go ahead and pour yourself a little more tea here. I'm about to drip on my watercolor paper, but luckily I have a rag right here. That's one of the benefits of watercolor painting, is you always have something to absorb your beverage close at hand. So I got my ginger tea ready to go. And I've got my black and white photo here. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna draw my frame. So go ahead and I'm gonna use my graphite pencil for that part. And I'm just gonna eyeball it and keep it small. So we're gonna do a landscape ethos style. So keep this small on your page. And I'm just gonna eyeball this a little bit here. And this is as big as I would recommend doing this right now. See that? You could do that. Learn a lot from doing small ones like that. Okay, sorry, zebra pins are all right, but I like this Pilot so much better. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to pay really close attention to I'm gonna start up here and just block in these basic shapes. So like, see the way the sky looks right there? What I'm gonna do right now is I'm going to imagine, like up there, the sky barely starts out on that upper corner. So on my drawing, up here in this upper corner, I'm gonna start out with that shape. See, and just get that kind of positioning where that's at. And now I'm gonna come down to here, see where that pale grass is coming in right there? That's that next hill that's in the foreground. Okay, so that's more than halfway down, but a little bit less than 2/3 of the way down. So I'm just gonna go onto my drawing, half, and then a little bit past half, and kind of sketch that in right there. Okay, now I'm gonna start coming around this bottom here, and I'm gonna look, this lowest spot here between where these two hills come together is pretty close to right in the middle. So now I'm just gonna kind of go like this, get a little benchmark measurement for that, see? Right there in the middle. Can you see that? Okay, and then now I'm gonna go up and I'm gonna look, where is this over here? Where does this hill come in over here? And it's right about half, or maybe it's almost the same as this one. So I'm gonna kind of imagine this line across to here and get that one in a little bit less than half again. And then the water comes in there too. So I'm gonna draw another line showing how that water starts to come in there. But I'm just kind of going through and getting these in first, because if I just start going in with broad strokes, it's really easy to mess up the proportions. And now I'm gonna look at this measurement right here, how much sky there is there, and it's like, it's probably about 1/4. So I'm gonna imagine where that would be on mine. Okay. Now I'm gonna have to start blocking in some of these bigger things. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with this sky shape and block that in. So now I'm paying attention to, so I got that whole sky blocked in there, see? That whole shape. That's gonna be my pale shape. Now next, I'm gonna look at, there's another shape right here, the furthest back hill that goes like that. Now I'm gonna block that one in. Can you see that one there? So I'm gonna block that one in and separate it from this one that comes up in front of it. All right, see how I got that one in right there? Okay, now I'm gonna get this big dark one over here on the side. So this slopes down. I've got this measurement where that comes in. I know that curves up. And so now I'm gonna draw this water line. So it's really important. There's several lines in here, and if you're drawing a landscape that has water in it, you're basically gonna have to deal with some sort of ellipses. Because of the way water settles, when you're looking at it in perspective, it creates lines that are regular, geometrically regular. So see this bit of deposited sand right there? That follows a very regular line, and this does as well, a fairly regular line. So it's important to pay attention to that and really observe the way those ellipses form. Now, if I were looking straight down from above, that would be a very round shape. But from this angle, it actually comes to a relatively sharp point there. So like, look at this point right here. Look at how sharp that comes to a very sharp point right there. See that? And our eyes often do this thing. When we see something like that, we tend to flip it and make it into a lot rounder of a shape than it really is, as if we were seeing it from above. But we're not seeing this from above. We're seeing this from an angle. So let me zoom back out here, and I need to get that line, but that is also the water line. So I'm paying attention to these types of water-induced kind of lines. Sometimes you might notice while you're doing this kind of stuff, if you're getting too caught up in being precise, then just practice that self-awareness. Notice that, and if that is actually becoming an obstacle, then maybe change your approach and just get a little bit looser with it. Just especially if the being all precise is slowing you down or creating some type of mental obstacle. Now I'm jumping around a little bit now. I'm going into this sort of island type peninsula there. I'm trying to pay attention to these curves that the shapes make as they go into the water, and trying to get those accurately, because those will give me this realistic sense of depth that helps make a landscape look good. So right now we're just focused on the composition and getting these sort of proportions in. We're not paying attention to value yet. Sometimes when I'm doing landscape ethos in the field, I'm thinking about value and my sort of proportions and composition at the same time. But right now, just to break it down and make it easier, we're gonna do one thing at a time. All right, so I've blocked in my basic shapes there. You can see that there's, it's not perfect, but there's a semblance to what I'm looking at, the photo I'm looking at, and I've got the basic shapes, and I think the composition is pretty good. This water element moves in a nice kind of curvy way. You can see that this very interesting curve is about 1/3 of the way from the right of the painting, leaving me 2/3 over here. So that's sort of following the rule of thirds. And that's also about 1/3 from the bottom of the painting, giving me 2/3 up from that. So this is good compositionally. Now what we're gonna do, and this is why we're using black and white, so we're not distracted by color, I'm gonna focus on values. So if you were to look at this right now, which is the darkest spot and which is the lightest spot? Like what do you see as the darkest spot in this entire thing? Now what I do when I'm trying to figure this out is I actually cross my eyes slightly or blur my vision. Some people squint. Anything you can do to help you see less details. Luckily, we've already taken the color away. If you have the ability, like in Photoshop, you can posterize it, and you could even reduce it to like probably 5 values would be good, and the computer will reduce the values for you, and you'll only see 5 values. So that would be a really cool way to practice this. But since we don't have that right now, I'm gonna say that the darkest spots that I see are some of these bushes over here, and then there's a few spots in here that seem to be very dark, and maybe right here. Then the lightest value I see, the sky is really supposed to have the lightest values in it, so there's definitely some light values there, but there's also this amazing highlight here where this grass is being hit by the sun. So paying attention to those, especially those, since we're working with watercolor, paying attention to these types of highlights that are down inside of the darker areas. There's also some interesting ones here on these rocks. So we're gonna have to reserve these since we're working with watercolor, and this would be a very good place to be careful and to reserve those whites, and also in there because they're surrounded by darks. It won't be as hard up here, but the main thing we want to do is not make the sky too dark, and we're probably not even gonna mess around with that until we get to the watercolor stage. But what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna start blocking in some of these other sort of like details and patches of value. So I'm actually gonna start first. I'm interested in this, what looks like a cast shadow down there on that bit of mud flat. Another cool thing to notice is look at this dark line coming around the edge of that little bit of that mud flat. That shows that it's a 3-dimensional object, and it will really pop if we can that will really pop 3-dimensionally if we can show that darkness. See that dark edge? It's sort of like a cookie that was a really runny batter, and when you baked it, it spread out. And if we don't show that that dark bit there, this is gonna look like a totally flat thing that's as flat as the water. And then also you can see it here. So that would be another good place to get your darks. So first we're gonna focus on lights, and then we're gonna we'll do a couple of these darks real quick, but we'll make sure that we reserve our white. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put that dark in around that bottom mud flat there, the edge of that ellipse, and I see this cast shadow down there as well, even though the cast shadow might kind of take away a little bit from the effect of the 3-dimensionality of the mud flat. I'm gonna put in some of these bushes. I might just color in like half of this slope over here because this whole slope is in shadow and really dark. It sort of depends on how much work you want to do with your pen and how much work you want to do with watercolor. Watercolor is the more efficient tool for doing this kind of big work, but sometimes I like to get some of the values in the drawing stage, just because the values are so important, and sometimes just busting them in real quick at the beginning is gonna help you out a lot. So when you're drawing or painting, you can make decisions about what you want things to look like, or what you're gonna exaggerate and what you're not gonna show. Unlike in photography. Well, you can kind of do it in photography. But for example, on this slope right here, there are bushes, and I want to show that this hill is receding into the distance, and you can see in the photo that you can notice that there are smaller bushes over here and bigger bushes in the foreground. But there are also some bushes that go against that because some bushes are just smaller than each other. It's not only about the distance. So in my drawing, however, I would rather exaggerate that to show that there's bigger bushes in the distance and they're getting smaller as they recede. Also, notice how these bushes, they show the shape of the hill as they go into the distance. And so trying to capture that in your drawing, sort of like you're looking at a chocolate chips on a cookie as they from like a weird angle, you know. And so making some of the big ones here in the foreground receding to smaller ones in the background, but being careful not to make it too regular. So our human brain likes to make everything regular and patterned, but in nature a lot of things are more random. So it can be hard to actually show the randomness of nature. Go back into your drawing and just, especially if you've just been using ink like I have been, and add like one more level of darkness. So right now you can see I have two values. I have white and then I have gray. Now I'm going back and I'm gonna look at the darkest spots that I see, those ones that I verbalized earlier, and I'm gonna go back and do another layer of this ink onto those to actually make them one level darker than the rest of the grays. And so that way you'll have three values on your paper, and we've simplified it for right now into three values, and that's probably something you want to shoot for. And the cool thing is that we're working with a monochrome image right now, so we're not thinking about color, we're not complicating hue and value, we're focusing just on the value, and it's actually the most important. So by getting these three basic values sort of dialed in before we're even working with color, it simplifies it a lot. That's why I'm showing you this way of doing it instead of us jumping straight to the watercolors where it'll be more confusing. So like for example, on these bushes, you can see that I'm going through and I'm adding a little bit of extra dark onto the side of them that would be in shadow, and then in these little like gullies and stuff, I'm adding another level of dark to show that there's that depth. And see how already that's created a sense of depth, and we haven't even started using our color yet. And I tried to do that thing around this cookie here, this cookie shape, but it didn't quite work, so I might have to adjust that some with the watercolor. Okay, so I would say once you get to a stage like that, where you can see that there's three values, go ahead and we'll switch our color back on. Okay, now look how much more complicated that is. So see, already like this color right here is confusing now, especially when you look at it up close. It's confusing, and some of these colors back here are confusing. They look like they go against the value that we just painted. They look like they're paler than they actually are, and that's because of the local color. It has nothing to do with the value. So it's so much easier to see the value. Like these whites on the rock don't look as bright to me as they did before, and now that I see the blue here, that seems like such a darker color than it was before. And that's where we're gonna start. We're gonna start with the sky. The sky can be really challenging because blue tends to be one of the most saturated and dark value colors in our watercolor kit, but everybody knows that the sky is blue, so when they start drawing it or painting it, they tend to end up making it too dark, but it should be one of the lightest values in your painting. So I have this little bit of test paper here. You could do this also inside of your sketchbook to test out some colors. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna mix a little bit of cobalt blue. I'm gonna tone it down because this is kind of a saturated sky, but a lot of it's white and sort of gray. So I'm gonna tone it down a little bit. I think that's cobalt blue. Tone it down a little bit, and then I'm gonna make sure I water it down a lot so it's not too dark of a blue. Maybe a little bit more. I'm gonna start more toned down and light, and I can always add a little bit more. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get ready. I think what I'm going to try on this painting is I'm going to try to make my clouds by sort of sucking up the color with paper towel. So I'm ripping off a little bit of paper towel, and I'm gonna use that to come in and suck up some of the blue that I put down here. So get all of that ready, because you know once you start doing this wash, things are gonna happen fast. So get it all ready to go in advance. It's part of doing watercolor. All right, so I'm gonna come in here. It's looking a little bit lighter than I need already, so I'm gonna come in here, lay this down. It's looking about right, maybe a teeny bit more saturation in some spots here. There we go, that's what I want. I got a little bit more saturation there, but be careful, you don't wanna make it too, it's really easy to overdo it and to end up with too dark of a value, and you can't go back since we're doing watercolor. Okay, so I got that down, it's still all wet enough. Now I'm gonna look at my cloud sort of orientation. Now I'm gonna take this paper towel, be careful it's not too patterned. Some of the paper towels have these crazy patterns. I'm gonna kind of come through here and kind of wipe it and just work on getting that sort of directionality that the sky in my photo has. Easy to overdo this part, it's so fun, so don't overdo it. And you can also overwork your paper. Some paper can't handle that much of it. You can see my paper is already sort of curling up a little bit, but luckily I'm not gonna be doing any more washes up here in the sky, I don't think, but you can see that my paper can't handle that type of rubbing. That might have been a little bit too aggressive for my paper, but I've got a few of them in. Probably just blotting might have been better than rubbing, but I've got a little bit of texture there. So that's good for me for the sky. It's a little bit, you know, the value is a little bit dark. So now while I have my blue, I am gonna do a little bit of the water. I tend to do that while I'm painting is I have one color, especially when I'm in the field and I don't have a bunch of towels and stuff. While I have one color on the brush, I try to get a couple other spots. So I'm gonna darken it a little bit, and I'm gonna tone it down and mix a little bit of green into it. I see green in that water, so toning it down, darkening it, and adding a little bit of green. And now I'm gonna go in there and let's see if I can bust out some of this water. And make sure if there's any sandy spots, in the water, on the edge of the water, or any highlights, make sure that you're either gonna come back and get those with a ink pen, a white ink pen, or that you're going to reserve them, because once this dark water goes down, you're not gonna be able to put anything light on top of it as far as watercolor goes. So make sure you think about that before you put down this darkness. Also, you want to think about what the adjacent colors are going to be and whether there's a chance for those to run, because if this is why in watercolor we generally start from light to dark, because if you put down a light color next to a dark color and the dark color is non-staining and it lifts up and kind of bleeds over into your pale color, you're not going to be happy. Sometimes when I do a landscape like this, I will paint the blue of the sky down into the background, because a lot of times those hills in the background have some of that blue to them. In this case, I feel like those hills aren't quite far enough away for that effect to really kick in. Okay, now while my stuff's still wet, I'm going to try to get some of this. This is a little bit dangerous and something I'm not really that great at yet, but while I have a little bit of wet on wet, I'm going to try to get some of these sort of subtleties in the water. But I don't want it to take away from, I still might want the water to be like a single contiguous block. I don't want the variations in the water to be greater than the variations between the water and everything else, if that makes sense. So the most important thing in doing this landscape is creating the sense of these sort of major blocks of elements. And if you get all fixed on, oh, look at those cool variations in the water, and you focus on that too much, and all of a sudden there's more variation inside the water than between the water and this mud flat, then you've lost. You could easily try to get too much texture too, or in your imagination, oh, that's water, it should have little ripples on it. So I started doing that a little bit. I'm gonna stop while I'm ahead and let that dry a little bit, because our next couple of sections, I think we might have to paint next to it. So Right now, what I don't want to do is paint any of these elements that are right up close to this water. So I'm going to look here. It looks like my sky is already dry enough. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint this hillside in the background. The furthest away hillside should be the lightest. And in my photo, it's not that evident, but this is something we can exaggerate, is that as things recede into the distance, they become paler, they become cooler, they become less saturated and less detailed. So in the front of my image is where I should have details, I should have more contrast, more saturation, and more warmth. So I'm gonna go ahead and create, I'm looking at these colors here, there's sort of this olive green grass. I'm gonna do a little bit of that and then get ready to bring in this other green, but I'm gonna keep those colors not very saturated and not very dark. That's something that you have to exaggerate a little bit in your painting. Okay, the Serpentine Genuine is a really, really useful color. I think I'm gonna start with that and maybe a little bit of this rich gold green. Quinacridone gold would probably also work. It's sort of like you could use that for almost anything. And I do want this to be darker. If you look at it, you can get confused, but it should be darker than the sky. Everything I do from here on out should be darker than the sky. That's more important than matching the color, is getting it to be darker than the sky. Another method for this, and I think I might just go ahead and do that, is you take that same color you're doing your background most hill in, and you do all of the foreground hills, and then what you do from then on out is you build up those foreground hills to be darker and more saturated by doing more layers. So see, I'm gonna just paint this as if it were all one flat block. And I think my water is dry enough at this point. So paint that as if it were all one solid block, all the way up onto this side as well. This method of doing it with multiple washes like that, sort of like a glazing effect, you need to be able to have a little bit more time for doing that. So sometimes in the field, I don't use that technique, but it does help. It can create the most accurate. I feel like, ooh, I started coming into my reserved whites there. It can create the most accurate effect, and it can also be, it can also make it so that you have a lot of continuity in your painting because your colors are all connected to each other because of that underlying base color. All right, see how there's a continuity there? And sometimes just keeping the shape simple and not getting too crazy. A lot of our California landscapes are very modeled, and there's like, oh, look, there's a different color there, and there's a different color there. And if you get too into like putting different colors all over the place, the whole thing just turns into this like wacky mosaic, and it's preferable to have some like continuity and connection between the elements. All right, so now I've got that green in, and I'm gonna let that dry for a second. While I'm doing that, I'm going to create this color up here in the front. This is a classic California color. The irony is usually that classic California color is from non-native grasses. So I'm gonna see if I can mix a little bit of quinacridone gold. Sometimes the Monte Amiata Natural Sienna is a good color for this to tone it down a little bit. Maybe mixing in, it can be relatively opaque, so I might mix a little bit of buff titanium in there as well. So here's a little bit of that buff titanium, which I think actually comes pretty close to that color in the foreground. You can see this color is starting to look like that grass color. So I'm just gonna go ahead and plop this down, and then I'll put the Serpentine Genuine on top for that coyote brush there. It looks very Serpentine Genuine. So Serpentine Genuine is a great, it's cool because Serpentine is our state rock, and it's the color actually is very useful for California landscape. So this was a little bit too watery, so I'm gonna go ahead and remix it. As I started to put it down on the paper, I saw it was too watery, so I'm remixing it a little bit here. And now I'm gonna lay it down into that foreground here on the left. And you could exaggerate the warmth of this because this is your most foreground hill. And so I'm gonna go ahead and get a teeny bit more of the quinacridone gold which is such a cool color, good for California, and put that down here. And it's fine that it's opaque because I'm not really gonna, I don't need the watercolor transparency in this element, this foreground element here. And now what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna lighten this like crazy, and just add a hint of it into that part back there where I have that that cool highlight grass, and probably just keeping it maybe like at the bottom even, and then sort of feathering it up into the tops to get that sort of look of like the backlit grass there, and bring some of that down into here. And I know I have some patches of it over here, but those patches of the same grass are all shaded and they don't stand out. And if in your mind you're like, oh, that's the same grass over there, and you start putting that same color there, it will take away from the effect. It's powerful when it's just in one spot, but then your brain is like, oh, that's the same grass over there. But since we looked at this in black and white, we know that even if it's the same grass, it's way darker over there and the color is totally different. So our brain and our visual system help us see that's the same grass, even though the light conditions are different. But that's a problem when we're painting. Like our visual system is meant to be able to look at a green apple in any light condition and see a green apple, because that's helpful for our survival. But for painting, you want to see the actual colors. You don't want to be identifying it as what it is. Okay, so I'm gonna show you sort of so far how that's going, and I think that's looking pretty good. Now what I'm noticing is that I sort of just have 3 values. It's kind of good that I put those, actually it's very good that I put those stronger values in with my pen earlier, because right now my watercolor is almost all the same value. There is a variation between the sky and everything else, but barely, so it's really subtle, and this is verging on anemic watercolors. If it weren't for my my pen work underneath, this would probably be anemic watercolors and just not strong enough to stand up on its own legs. So it's good that we put that ink in underneath. That's a good sort of trick. But now after this dries a little bit, I'm gonna put in another layer of darks to really push those values and focus on the spots that I see as really dark in my painting. Then I'm gonna come in with some of these other local colors. So I've added some of the local color, which can be problematic and confusing. I was interested in trying to match the colors down here a little bit more, which are very saturated in these 2 locations. But due to where they are in relationship to the sense of depth, I don't want to make them too strong, because as you can see here with this foreground one, or sort of middle foreground one, it's taken away from the sense of depth when I added that much detail to it. But I did succeed, I feel like, adding a little bit of local color to these hills here without confusing the sense of depth. And now I'm gonna add some more sort of details into my 2 most foreground hills, so these 2 right here, to make those pop. I also added a layer there to make that one as dark as it needs to be, even though I probably should exaggerate it even more, because in the photo you can see it's really, really dark. It practically looks black in the photo. It can be really hard, and this is the kind of thing that you might have more freedom with in a very small one, is just to see like how dark can you make that, and what does it look like, because a lot of people with watercolor end up going too light. So practicing, like taking it to the extreme and getting really dark, is a good way to learn what the limits are. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put in some more of these foreground bushes, and I think I might even just be taking some paint straight from the pans to get these to pop really dark, especially in contrast with my that reserved light spot. So I'm going to take some straight serpentine genuine to make some of these bushes here. And we've already made the bushes with our gray pen or pencil, so they already have some value, which helps a lot, but pushing the value even more with the watercolor will help. Now I noticed there's sort of these weird foreground bushes that are light, but I don't know if I'm going to mess around with those. Those might take away from the effect. So part of painting is landscapes, is learning what these concepts are and learning the way things should look. And if you understand the way things should look, it helps you make some of the decisions, because you're inevitably making decisions of what to include and what not to include And if you're not making decisions, it's sort of just happening randomly. And if it's happening randomly, it's not always going to be in your favor. So if you've noticed that sometimes your paintings come out really good and sometimes not so much, it might be because there's sort of decisions that you should be making that are sort of, because you don't have as much experience, they could be kind of happening accidentally. And sometimes that works out, and more likely than not, it doesn't. So figuring out what some of these principles are will really help you. Now I'm going to take some straight serpentine genuine for these bushes back here. I think those are actually bay trees. And those are some of my darkest spots. So I'm actually I'm gonna start using my, what is that, Indanthrone green? No, Paraline green, for pushing these values. And I'm gonna do the shadows, especially on these closer bushes. On faraway bushes, I'm not gonna put 2 values in a bush, but close-up bushes, I will put 2 values, because in the foreground you have more contrast and more detail, remember, but in the background you don't have that much contrast and value. And I'm gonna make some of these stick up in front of that little mud flat, because that mud flat there is starting to get a little bit out of control and doesn't look very like it's part of the overall composition. So by painting some bushes overlapping it, that will help it recede into the distance. Now I just made those bushes way too linear. I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna add a little bit of local color, but you don't wanna get too crazy with this. I see a color in there that reminds me of my chromium oxide color, sort of like a willow leaf color. I'm not sure exact. I think some of those might be willows, and I'm gonna do something with that here in the foreground, but this is where you could start losing. Oh, and that's not coming out the way that I wanted. But I'm just gonna add a little bit more of craziness there in the foreground. Hopefully it will kind of make this mud flat recede in the distance. Woo! This is where you start getting risky, and you could either stop early or you can push yourself. Sometimes it's good to learn what it means to overwork a painting, and see like where things go wrong. So that's part of the reason why making a small painting and not getting too attached to it, you can experiment. But there is something to be said for, it's easy to overwork a painting and knowing when to stop, but sometimes it's good to go past that point and see what will actually happen if you go past that. Now I'm getting risky, adding some details into some of these background elements. I want to get a little bit of the feeling of rocks there, which I totally lost the feeling of those rocks. So I'm going to come in here with a little bit of gray and see the value's totally off at this point, because those rocks actually need to be paler than the grass around them. So by putting gray on there, it's not helping at all. So I'm going to call it, I'm going to quit this at this point. You could potentially go in and add some more darks. You could add some more darks. You could add some more if you wanted to, and this would be another dangerous thing to do, is you could come in with your, where'd my white gel pen go? So you could come in with your white gel pen, and there's not really that much crazy stuff in here that would require this, I don't think. But this, let me test this out here, because this can come out all gunky like your eyes in the morning. You could add some of this, see? Just a little bit. Don't get too crazy with that. See that? Just a teeny bit of that looks good, but you overdo it and it's bad. And I don't see any white on the water, so I'm not going to pretend like there is. It would be really easy to pretend. Maybe I'll add, see, it's not totally dry. I almost went in there to add some white to those rocks there, but it's not totally dry, so that would have come out horrible. So I'm not going to mess around with this anymore. This painting is done. Now, at this point, giving yourself a little bit of feedback, looking at it, thinking about it, reflecting, looking back at the photo. You could turn the photo back into black and white, see what happens, see what you think. Okay, now check your values again, like, how close are my values? I can really see these dark spots are nowhere near as dark as they are in the painting. Not even close, okay? So see this whole slope right there? In the painting, that's so dark. So the thing I would do next is I would say, okay, now I'm gonna do a 5-minute drawing on here just with pencil, Pencil is a really good one to build up value and see how close you can get to these actual values. Also with pencil, you can use your eraser and you could erase out this white stuff and go back and forth, work it back and forth. So graphite, charcoal, and oil painting, or acrylic painting too, give you these options of going back and forth with these values, and you'd be able to get these really precise. So if you want to do a little bit of mixed media, try those media for a little bit. Even with graphite or charcoal, you could do it in a small block like this and practice getting your values right, and then come back to your watercolor. See if any of those skills are transferable. So I hope that video helped you out and gave you some cool ideas for how you can paint a landscape from a photo at home. I hope you're staying safe and healthy at home, and also sane. So don't forget, you can still nature journal, you can still read. Don't spend too much time on the computer. Set a little time limit, and I'm going to be trying to make as much content as I can during this sort of quarantine crazy period with coronavirus. And if you can't wait all the way until next Wednesday for the next episode of the show, check out these 2 videos here.